Hello everyone, hope you're doing well. Today it's time to have a look at the UK when it comes to its leaked vehicles. There's a ton of different ones, and what's really nice about this lot is there's some ground, there's some air, and then there's also some navals. There's a little bit of everything, which I think is kind of important. You know, you want a decent balance between things, and a lot of the nations that we're going to be going into do have that, which is really cool. So anyway, let's get into it. The first vehicle is the Vickers Mk.11. Now, this one's pretty interesting. Imagine if you took a standard vehicle which was designed for kind of moving around troops and then just stuck a turret on it. That's pretty much what the Vickers Mk.11 is. It is a 6x6 setup, a wheeled chassis, and what's kind of interesting as well is this thing's actually amphibious. Which is kind of odd. It does actually have a propulsion system for it as well, so it doesn't just float. This thing also has access to the Cummins C4T A8.3 turbocharged diesel engine, which is quite nice, and also has a lot of components in it that are domestically available, or even commercially available, I should say. But the main thing that isn't commercially available is the turret that's sat on the top of it. This thing mounts a Vickers Mk.5 turret, or if you might know it in the game, the VFM5 turret. It's got an L7 105mm low recoil rifled gun. It obviously fires APFSDS if it wants to, and also at the same time is fully stabilized. We have the turret already in the game on the VFM5 itself. So imagine you take that turret and just plop it on something like this. What's also pretty cool is it has access to 4 crew members and can carry 7 additional people. So technically this would be an IFV, which is really interesting. One is very similar, I suppose, to like stuff like the Rattle and things like that, in the way that it's set out. But yeah, it's a pretty interesting little machine. I've always liked to look at it whenever it has been chatted about, and it's always good to see it about. The next vehicle is another Challenger 2, the Megatron. And with the Megatron, it's kind of interesting because it's not actually a combat Challenger 2. This is more of a test bed or a demonstrator one. It's actually operated by the Armoured Trials and Development Unit in Britain. And what it is it's a way of being able to test future stuff that maybe they want to implement on the Challenger 2 chassis. The reason it's known as the Megatron is because at one stage of its life, it actually had a Transformers logo on it, and that's pretty much it. So it's kind of interesting, and obviously the reason why a lot of people know about this one is because it ends up at Tankfest quite a lot as a vehicle. So talking about stuff such as, you know, its size and what it has on top of it, a lot of the time it's actually been fitted with stuff such as Dorchester level 2 armor, and the reason for this is not to actually, you know, set it up for combat. It's to actually test the practical application of it, such as the mobility of it, since of course it adds extra weight, and also if it's able to just kind of carry it. So it was also fitted with DL2F, which are ERA blocks mounted on the DL2B turret side modules. So therefore you could actually, it would technically have extra additional armor compared to the other Challengers in the game, but it probably won't be that effective. The suspension as well is something which has changed over the years. One of them is that it was given a new hydrogas suspension system to handle increased weight during 2010. And also what the Megatron has access to is the Challenger 2E's engine, the 1500 horsepower MTU-MT AA3 diesel engine. So if they add this to the game and they add all of the different components from over the years, since it is a demonstrator, it could actually work pretty well. It also, of course, has the 120mm gun. It can fire all of the standard rounds as you would find, and generally would be kind of an interesting vehicle. I think what you're looking at is the chunkiest Challenger, but with the increased engine power, maybe it'll be slightly quicker than stuff that we already have in the game. The next one is for South Africa, and it is for a pretty interesting vehicle. It's the Olifant Mk.1B. Now, if you want to actually learn more about this thing, there's a really good tank encyclopedia article about it. Definitely worth a read. I'll just read you the development section right now. So, unlike the Mk.1A, which is an upgrade of the Centurion Mk.5 hull, the Mk.1B was a complete rebuild, and in doing so left behind the legacy, features, and outer look of the Centurion MBT. Development of the Mk.1B commenced soon after the Mk.1 went into production in 1981. The Olifant Manufacturing Company set out to design and build an interim MBT that would improve the shortcomings of the Mk.1A, which were exposed during the South African border war, such as poor armor, poor mobility, improved firepower, and taxing maintenance requirements. The Mk.1B was designed to face off against T-55s, T-62s, and T-72A MBTs, which are equipped respectively with 100, 115, and 125mm main guns. The primary focus, therefore, was placed on protection, followed by improved firepower capabilities, then mobility, and lastly reduction of vehicle maintenance and crew fatigue. A total of 44 Mk.1Bs would be built starting in 1991. South Africa is the sole user of this, of which 26 of them were upgraded to the Mk.2 standard in 2005. Presently, 12 Mk.1Bs are in storage, with one South African tank regiment. So, generally, when we have a look at this vehicle, it's much closer to the Mk.2 than it is to the Mk.1. It has access to 105mm GT3B, which is a very nice gun, but the main issue that this thing had was it had a pretty poor power-to-weight ratio. It was still 14.4 horsepower per ton, which ain't, terrible compared to a lot of vehicles, but you got to remember, this was a 1990s vehicle, so we're not talking about, something which was a bit earlier. But generally, it's is seen as a nice interim between different variants of the vehicle, and a lot of the technologies which they kind of worked on it were transferred over to the Mk.2 and are used to this day. A helicopter also enters the mix in the form of the Wessex Mk.5. This was obviously known as the Westland Wessex. This was a British-built variant of the Sikorsky H-34, which we already have in-game, at least in one form or another. I think there might be two variants of it. But this one, is basically just the license-built one made by Westland Aircraft at the time, which then turned into, of course, Westland helicopters. So it wouldn't be anything too different. The coolest thing about this is the engine placement in the front of it, how it's angled kind of into the pilots themselves. A very kind of unique design compared to helicopters, where a lot of them actually just had them near the top of the blade. It would probably be kind of a simple helicopter. I don't know how many armament types it would have, probably not a lot, since a lot of the Wessexes were used for kind of non-combat roles in a way. Like, a lot of them were used for stuff like search and rescue by the Navy, and also just general utility stuff. It also did some anti-submarine warfare stuff with the Royal Navy, so I don't really know how that would actually fit with it. But yeah, well, at least in War Thunder, I should say. But so this is basically just a British H-34. Then you've got a specific version of the welkin, the F Mark 1. Now, in the past, there's actually been two welkins that have been found around the place, so I'm guessing that's been condensed into one, at least for this set of things. The welkin's a pretty interesting one. Imagine if you took something like a whirlwind and you kind of elongated it, so you just made it wider and gave it some different engines. This thing had access to two Rolls-Royce Merlins with some good old superchargers, and the idea of it was that it would combat very, very high altitude German aircraft which were coming in to bomb Britain. It would be an interceptor. But the thing is, the Germans never really made anything which went as high as this thing was supposed to go. So since this thing had a ton of issues when it came to its general development, and also since the threat wasn't really there, then it wasn't really used. It's probably the best way of putting it. There's a lot of aircraft in the war which were kind of designed to combat threats which they thought might happen, or they thought that, they had some intel on, and eventually, obviously, the other side either couldn't get it to work or decided it wasn't worth it. And the Welkin is one of these vehicles. It had access to 4 20mm cannons, very similar to the Mosquito, where they're sat under the nose in a belly-mounted tray. And also, at the same time, it was also briefly considered for reconnaissance missions, but it was never deployed in that role. So it never really got its feet under it, because it just had a ton of problems with it. But at the same time, it wasn't a complete waste of time. The vehicle itself actually had it created this kind of cockpit pressurization system, which is still kind of used today, because of the fact that the Air Ministry wanted it to have a service ceiling of 44,000 feet. So they had to actually develop a pressurizing system that meant that the pilot could actually survive at those altitudes. And they still use similar stuff to it today in modern aircraft, which I think is really cool. So even though this thing isn't actually, it didn't really do anything in real life, some of the technology that was developed off it still gets used today, which is pretty cool. To start off the naval stuff, we have the Restigouche class destroyer. Now, this actually is a Canadian destroyer. Restigouche is an area of New Brunswick in the east. And New Brunswick is actually one of the only places in Canada which is actually bilingual when it comes to its actual governance and all of that stuff. A lot of places in Canada are either one language or another. They're either French or they're English, mainly English, at least from what I've seen. But New Brunswick is one of those areas which actually is technically bilingual, which is pretty interesting. So the Restigouche is a very modern destroyer. They were commissioned in 1958. There were 7 of them which were built and 7 of them which are retired. So they all survived, which is always quite nice to see. And they served all the way up until 1998, which is kind of crazy. A decent period of time for pretty much all of them. And as they were built, they had a pretty weak armament. They had access to 1 3-inch Mark 6 Vickers. They also had a single 3-inch twin mount on it as well. They had some mortars and also some homing torpedoes, which we'll have to see if those ever come to the game. And that's really about it when it comes to its armament. But obviously, serving for a long time, they actually went through a bunch of different refits, which make them a little bit more interesting. They got the improved Restigouche escorts kind of improvement on them, and also the Destroyer Life Extension program as well. So after both of these, they added what could be classed as some pretty gnarly stuff. So you obviously have a bunch of sensors and radars and all of that stuff, and also some EWS stuff on top of it as well. But just from an armament point of view, it had the twin mount still for the 3-inch Vickers gun, so that stayed. But then they added an ASROC launcher. Now, the ASROC launcher is quite a deadly piece of kit. They kept the triple torpedo launchers, the Mark 32s, and the ASROC, or the RUR-5 ASROC as it's known. This thing is a all-weather, all-sea condition anti-submarine missile system. It was made by the US in the 50s, and generally is just a very interesting set of things. It's just pretty much designed to annihilate anything in front of it, which is pretty interesting. You have the Saetta, is it the Saetta, I believe, which is in the Italian tree with the missiles. and eventually we'll start getting other machines which will have them as well. And then after the Gulf War, it got refitted again. So not just keeping that 3-inch twin mount in the front, which has, survived for this whole time, it also then got fitted with Harpoon quad SSM launchers. So therefore, it could fire javelin SAMs and also blowpipes, which are pretty fun. Even though they were just man-portable, they were kind of fixed to the machine itself. It also had two 40mm 60 Bofors, 650 cals, and also the two Mark 32 triple torpedo launchers. So this thing, there's technically 3 variants we could get in the game. 2 of them heavily rely on missiles, and then 1 just has a few guns on it, and that's basically it. But this would be a Cold War destroyer for the British. The Iron Duke class as well makes an entrance in the form of the battleship, the Iron Duke. This was a class of 4 ships which were built, good old dreadnought battleships during the First World War, and they were in service from 1914 to 1946. They completed all 4 of them, and all of them survived, which is kind of a surprise. They were scrapped, though, later on, but still pretty impressive. Usually this obviously didn't happen. Usually you would lose one, or it would get refitted, or something would go on with it. The vehicles themselves had 5 twin 13.5-inch guns, which are 343mm guns, 12 single 6-inch guns, 2 single 3-inch AA guns, and then also 4 21-inch torpedo tubes. The belt itself of armor was 12 inches thick, and of course it could motor around. All of these things were laid down in 1912. A lot of them were launched in 1912 or 13, and they were all commissioned into 1914. So all of them were ready to go by the 10th of November 1914, the last one of the 4 being the Emperor of India, which was broken up at Rosyth in 1932. The only one which actually kind of participated, I suppose, in the Second World War was the Iron Duke. It was broken up in Glasgow in 1949, where the rest of them were broken up in the early 30s. So, following the end of the First World War, the Iron Duke was transferred to the Mediterranean Fleet, and during 1919 and 1920, the ship operated in the Black Sea in support of the White Russians during the Russian Civil War. The Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 mandated that Iron Duke be removed from the active roster. However, she remained with the fleet for a short time, having been transferred to the Atlantic Fleet in 26. This duty assignment lasted 3 years, after which she was removed from active service. She was demilitarized to be used as a training ship. 2 of her guns and a good deal of her armor were removed, and her speed was reduced to 18 knots through the removal of some of the boilers. She was also later used as a depot ship in Scapa Flow, starting in 1939. After the outbreak of the Second World War that year, her remaining guns were removed to be used in shore defenses. Luftwaffe bombers attacked her on the 17th of October 39, but they didn't hit. Several near misses caused significant damage, and after repairs were effected, the ship resumed her duties as a depot vessel until the end of the war, and then being finally scrapped in 1946. So the vehicle itself, when it was in the Second World War, was definitely not the same vehicle that it was in the First, just to kind of give you an idea of the life of the Iron Duke. The last ship is the HMS Renown, and it was a battle cruiser, which was around in the First World War. The vehicle itself, though, was supposed to be an improved version of the Revenge-class battleships, but unfortunately, because of the First World War breaking out, it got suspended when it came to its development. And then later on, they decided to restart its development and construction and change it into a battle cruiser instead. So the vehicle itself was ordered in 1914, but it was only launched on the 4th of March 1916 and being put into service a few months later. It was then stricken from the Naval Registry in 1948 and then sold for scrap. after that, which is kind of interesting. The vehicle itself, when it comes to its armament, so it had 3 twin 15-inch guns, or 381mm guns, pretty big, and then 10 twin 4.5-inch DP guns, and also 3 octuple 2-pounder AA guns as well as a setup. This one obviously survived the First World War and also took part in the Second World War. The reason why a lot of people know about the HMS Renown is because it's one of the vehicles which actually was involved in the search for the Graf Spee in 1939 and also participated in the Norwegian campaign and the search for the Bismarck in 1941. So generally it was something which was involved in a decent amount of the larger naval engagements during the Second World War and has a very tenured history, not just in the First World War but in the interwar periods and also the Second World War itself. Definitely worth reading about. A lot of really cool information on this vehicle. Since it is a battle cruiser, it doesn't have as much armor as some other vehicles would have. The general thing is it's had different refits during its time. The one that I said to you was the one from the Second World War. The major differences, of course, being the AA armament, which is on these general vehicles. The armor of the battlecruiser, when built, was at maximum 6 inches on the belt, which is obviously not great compared to many, but it still had the big donker guns at the end of the day. That is all of the vehicles that were leaked for Britain in this set. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next time. I'd like to thank Forge, Siegebreak, Carrion Crow, Nicholas Richardson, Elove Goat, Pyman, Winter Scientist, Merciless Reaper, Orange Tail, Teddy, Daniel Stanton, Moxie, B. Young, and also Sem Arslan, Wilkski, Uncle Bean, Derek R., Bareen, Lafouche, and Samuel Slick for supporting the channel.